I'm going live now, so be quiet. Hello and welcome back. Hopefully we're all stretched out after Fit with Frank. Just glad the camera wasn't on me for that stretching session. No one needs to see that on a Friday afternoon. We're now welcoming Amanda Coleman, who is Director of Amanda Coleman Communications. Amanda is a crisis communications consultant, and after the last few years we've had, there's certainly been a demand. So looking forward to this talk. Amanda's going to talk about crises and how we can build resilience. So again, don't forget to respond with your emojis, put some comments in the chat along the talk, and put any questions you've got in the Q&A. I'll hand over now to you, Amanda. Looking forward to this one. See you soon.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that. It's good to be here again. I really do always enjoy speaking at commsHERO. And hopefully today I'll give you some food for thought. I haven't got the answers. I haven't got a blueprint. But hopefully I'll give you some things to think about which might help you going forward. And listening to Rebecca before, when she was talking about preparing and language, a lot of which I'm going to talk about, but in getting ready for the problems that we're all likely to face or possibly face. Um, this is me. I'm sure some of you have already kind of seen me before when I talk. I'm quite passionate about crisis comms. I wrote a book about it. I have to tell people that. And I wrote a second book, which I'll talk about before I finish, so you'll let you know if you're really interested. And I spend a lot of time looking at crisis and issues management all over the place. And I'm going to use some examples as we go through just to highlight things we're talking about. And I also now am linked to the Emergency Planning Society, which is something I never thought I would do, but actually is incredibly beneficial because emergency planners do loads and loads of work in this sort of space of getting ready and preparing and being resilient. And it's important for me that the comms element is a key part of that. So before 2022, what were we talking about? Well, we'd had quite a nice time. I was going to say, I was just talking backstage about, the last few years before, COVID, before we've got into this turbulent state that we're in. We dealt with very, very similar things. We had some floods, we'd have some kind of weather events, but a lot of it was kind of predictable, I would call it. It was things that we were all used to. We could become a bit numb, I think, to a lot of those things. Um, and what we're looking now is we've really had a wake up call first with COVID, but now with the state of the world. And last week there was the International Monetary Fund chief, and I'm not going to try and pronounce her name because she was on television, I think, yesterday, was talking about a fundamental shift from relative stability. And there was a quote that I used in something that I found that she said, where it was talking about a world in which any country can be thrown off course more easily and more often. So why does this matter for comms? Well, for me, it's because this is our space. This is how we can come and step in and really help our organisations and businesses. And it doesn't matter where you're working, but I think this is where, as an expert, we become the trusted advisor, those trusted experts, and people, I think, hopefully, after COVID, have become much more aware of the role and the impact that comms can have. So the key is that we keep moving forward. And I know lots of people probably going, but do we really have to keep thinking about crisis and issues management? Because that's like, that was ages ago. And really, do we need to be doing that? Yeah. For me, you just make it part of your day to day. And this is what I'm kind of trying to go through now. Because we're in a chaotic state, and it doesn't matter where you are or what you're looking at. The world is in a chaotic state. We've got the war, obviously Russia's war in Ukraine, the impact, the ongoing legacy of the pandemic, and you can't underestimate that. All the things we're seeing about the health situation and the kind of delays and waiting lists. You've got impacts on education. There's been a huge knock-on effect, and that's going to be for quite a period of time. So we've got all the continued impact of that, climate change and climate issues, and again, massive issue, massive issue. Who would have thought we would have been seeing the temperatures that we had to experience this summer? I just never would have anticipated it. So you've got all those issues. The financial, I mean, let's not even go about the financial and political climate, and it's not just in the UK, it's in other countries as well. So we've got these kind of all these elements that are making modern life really challenging. They're making them challenging for everybody. People are really struggling. We know that. We're probably part of that group. Things are difficult. We're all trying to look at, again, turning the lights off. We were talking before backstage about, there's an app that apparently will tell you about any electricity being used in your house, so you can go around and say to people, turn the lights off. We're all living in this like struggling kind of state, which puts our resilience already low. And that's my kind of message today: is what can we do? What things can we as communicators be thinking about to try and help people along this route? We've got to be aware of what's going on, and I think I listened to Sarah Waddington talk at the start of the week, and uh, looking at what Stephen said as well. We've got to be aware of what's going on in the world around us, because if we're not, then we're going to be out of step. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to do the wrong thing. And I've got some examples of, misunderstanding where the world is as we go through. So communication for me, as you would imagine, I would always say it is critical, absolutely front and centre. We need to look at what we can do and how we can develop. So what are the things that I think we need to be thinking about? Key bits around building resilience and the things that matter to crisis and issues management. Big piece for me at the minute, big push for me is on issues management, getting ahead of those things before they become a problem. We can't always do it with everything, but we can do it with lots of things. So let's look at what we can do. We've got mood and tone, we've got empathy, language, inclusion, behavioral awareness. And again, I know we've talked about that during the week. Being prepared, and I will go into that in a little bit, and ultimately being human. So, the mood and tone bit. What are people saying? How are they feeling? We can't just assume that we know these things because this is how we are feeling. And sometimes it becomes a trap that we fall into. I'm really upset about X, Y, and Z, then probably everybody else is. So, how do we build that consultation in? How do we get the listening in? Not just social listening, because we can do that, the technology's there, but how do we do it wider? How can we build methods and measures in things that will give us that connectivity with what's going on outside? A real example for me of how organizations and businesses haven't listened to what the kind of mood and tone is around things was the government and the 45p tax, slashing that, and then the U-turn and everything else. But there's clearly nobody's understanding the impact that is going to have, consequences. And again, we're there. We should be there as communicators, talking this through and saying, really, how's that going to land? The mood out there is like this. So we need to be educating ourselves so we're in the right place. And we also then need to be able to bring that into organizations, that kind of insight. We've talked before the exercise session about data. We need that insight, that data. We need to be able to put that into what people are doing. Real important one for me, this is language. I'm doing a piece of work with the humanitarian aspects group from the Emergency Planning Society, where we're trying to pull together this issue around language, because there's some work that's already been done for Survivors Against Terror and some other people looking at journalists and how they report on issues and crisis. But the words bit's critical, and we need to get that support there for communicators, because whatever you're writing starts to become kind of the basis for what journalists produce, and it's that underlying element. So we've got to get right what we say. We've got to be really careful about our wording, and we've got to be sure that we're replicating that mood and tone as effectively as we need to be. We need to be aware of what people are concerned about and listening and understanding, and one word can make a big difference. Puts a massive pressure on us, but for me, just think of again, one of the things recently, there was a terrible shooting in Uvalde in America, and the police chief, who now has been sacked, was caught asking, what he was going to say, and he was on the way into a meeting, and he turned around, and the phrase that sticks in my mind was, he said, "We'll speak to parents and we'll sort this and that when they've done grieving." And that was his phrase, when they've done grieving. How do you not understand what's going on? Didn't understand the first bit of the mood and tone. The language was terrible. So we have to get better. We have to get more aware of the language that we're using and what is that saying to people, and how is that helping people through. And a really important element for me, and again, listening to Rebecca before was interesting around what she was saying early on, the diversity and inclusion element, because we often think about it in our day-to-day work, but then an issue happens, a crisis happens, and we seem to forget it. Again, the IMF from very recently was talking about the inequalities that problems and troubled times produce. We've got to be aware of this because we're just going to make things worse with our communication if we're not careful, we're not aware. Do we know where the gaps are in when we're communicating? Do we know where our audiences are? Do we understand how we're reaching them? Is our language, talking about the last slide, inclusive? Are we using Boris Johnson Latin, or actually are we talking to people in ways that they understand? Not talking down to them, but just talking so that they can actually understand what's happening, and make sense of this chaos in the world around us. And we can't forget this when we're dealing with a crisis. It's so important. I'm just in a rewrite now, or well, just finished a rewrite now of the first book I did on crisis communication, and there's a whole section I've included around diversity and inclusion and how important it is and what we need to think about. So for me, this is, in terms of getting resilient, we've got to be able to factor this in. This is a really key part, because if we are not careful with communication, we will be exacerbating that inequality, and the inequality is going to be there from the whatever's happened. But if we're not careful, the consequences of what we do can just make that worse. Also, again, behavioural awareness, and great sessions this week, which have touched on this. And I know some of you probably have seen the government's thing that came out recently around crisis comms and a behavioural approach. But it's really important for us all to have a look at that. So don't just think, oh, I'm not really doing crisis comms. Have a look at what's in there, because it starts to cast doubt around these things that often have become kind of become myths around dealing with people and how they respond. So there's always this issue of, well, people will panic about X, Y, and Z. And there's a guy called Dr. Chris Cocking who's again, he advised on some of this, working out of Brighton, and he talks about this as being just nonsense. It's been debunked ages ago by the academics, and yet often as communicators we're going, well, we need to make sure that people aren't going to panic and not going to worry. If you watch that Make Me Prime Minister on Tuesday night this week, what a nightmare. You could see how things go. Anyway, I could go on off a tangent about that. But what's important is really understanding the behavioural elements of this. And if you haven't ever looked at social psychology, then I would say have a look at the social psychology and see what's in there. Because, I did a very short course online some years ago, and it was massively beneficial to me, because it does start you to question the way people behave, and it starts to question those things that we just get biases on, we just take for we just make it, expect that's the way things are going to be. So definitely have a look at this. For me, the crisis and behavioural kind of awareness, this piece which this document kind of covers, used to be seen as two separate things. It's absolutely part of the same thing now. So when we're looking at some of these issues and crises that we're dealing with, we've got to be thinking about what's the behavioural impact on this, what do we need to look at in terms of the behavioural comms changing, and what we're going to do. Another aspect for me within this is about being human, and not that I like to use a Steve Coogan related sort of meme, but I did find this one which was in relation to the centre parks. If everybody remembers, sorry if anybody's from centre parks on here, but it was just too obvious an example to not use. But centre parks not reading the mood, not consulting, not understanding, failing to look at that, not being human. It kind of embodied a lot of that, and I'm sure lots of us were sitting there thinking, why have those managers, the senior, the big bosses at centre parks, not actually just thought through the consequences of that decision, and what they were going to do, and looked at the alternatives, which they ended up doing in the end. And it's that sort of bit of being human and thinking, a real person with empathy would understand the impact that decision's going to have on a family, would kind of be able to recognise that. Hopefully they would have that listening in place if they haven't got that kind of human aspect. And after 20 odd years in policing, you do meet people it's very senior levels sometimes that don't have very much humanity and understanding of how people really are. But this for me is really important for us. It's what comms can really bring in. We can bring this into our plans and into our approaches, so it's got to remain in our thoughts. Is whatever we're doing going to feel, going to look like, what's it going to actually how's it going to impact on people? And that way, then the other elements we can talk about you can bring them into play. But at the end of the day, we have to step into that strategic advisory role, and really push it forward. Hopefully, from that COVID kind of support wave that we did have. Um, Preparation for me, I deal with crisis comms. Of course, I'm going to say that preparation is key, but it is. If you're going to get resilient, you have to have had these conversations beforehand. You have to have thought things through. You need a plan. You need a starting point. You need to have considered those elements I've been talking about around how do we make sure we're reflecting mood and tone and diversity. And another bugbear for me, don't that we're going to be able to effectively look at social media, and you can't just have a one line in a plan that says we'll do some social media, because it's so vast now. You've got to be really clear about what you're going to do with it. And we should have exercised it, we should have tested it, we should have got a level of understanding around how we approach decision making. There's a big learning thing here, and I think we're in this chaotic time. This sort of training, this sort of support and consideration has to be within what we're doing. We need CPDs that keep looking at these aspects of, effective decision makings under pressure, and how we're going to respond to a crisis, and how we're going to look at, managing the comms around a serious situation. And we should have trained teams so that the teams can all then step in and they know what they need to do. It brings us in planning some certainties, and this is for me that chaos that we're living in. We need the certainties as much as we can get them, not just and if you're within a team, that's what the team need. They need some certainties of, right, when something happens, this is what I need to do. But also that's where they can boost their own resilience as well. So if they're feeling a bit stressed, a bit pressured, feeling a bit like, and then something happens, at least they have something to fall back on. They have a starting point, they have a plan and an understanding of that will help them through it. I do think there's a massive issue in about how we all need to improve our resilience. It's a bit like doing the fitness bit, which I was having a chat backstage, so I didn't do it. But that's really important, because we all need to leave ourselves a little bit of space so that when something happens, we've got a bit of resilience left in the bag. And I always talk about it like it's a rucksack, isn't it, filled with stuff, filled with bricks. If you're full and then something else happens, then you've got nowhere to go with it. So we always need to be making sure that we're keeping that little bit in reserve, so that we can we're not exhausted when something inevitably does happen. And I think there's the acceptance now that things are going to happen, that the world isn't going to run smoothly. It is going to be turbulent. It is going to be rocky. So before I kind of keep blathering on, what next? What do we do from here? I think first is what I was talking about. Consider your own resilience. If you suddenly got something today that's going to knock you, because it's going to be a problem for the next few days, over the weekend into next week, would you be able to deal with it? If not, then think about, what can I do to boost my own resilience? Go for a walk, spend some time, switch things off, go away from social, whatever it is that helps to boost you to get away from the day to day kind of pressures. Then put that in place pretty quickly. Um, Look at that day-to-day support. What are you doing on a day-to-day basis that starts to support the recognition of issues as they emerge, and trends and problems that may happen in the future? We're in the best place possible. We see the media, we see the social media, we see the rumors, the discussions, things as they start to pop up and emerge. So we are in a really luxurious position in one respect, that we can start to look at what's happening and what's going to be there, and make sure that the support mechanisms, the systems that you may need. And I'm sorry, organisations, but sometimes you have to invest in really good monitoring systems. We've talked a lot this week in different sessions about freeness and free tools, and I think those are great. And I've spent years and years and years using free tools and free versions. But sometimes you go, this is really important, this system, and then find the methods by which to kind of demonstrate that, and hopefully get the funding for it. We need to check our plans and make sure they are robust enough to deal with a turbulent time that we're going to face, that they can change and adapt, that they can deal with 2, 3, 4 issues, crises that we may be trying to manage all at once. And we need to look at them for those key elements that we mentioned: the behavioural awareness, the understanding language, the mood and tone, and the diversity and inclusion. We need to make sure that we've reflected all those in what we've got already in place. and we need to test and train for it. We need to keep people up to speed. We need to make it less of a, oh my God, something's happened, and okay, I know something's happened. I've got these things in place and I know what I've done in the past. And in all of these things, and if anybody's heard me talk before, one of the things I'm always passionate about is that we have to be human, and we need to remember the people in all this. And that's what should be at the front of our minds. So, what do we do now? What do I hope that you will, not today because it's Friday afternoon, but like, what I do I hope that you will take away from this and start to kind of hopefully do? Review those existing plans, look at how your day-to-day operation works. Can you identify those issues and escalate them when you need to? Can you get ahead of the next crisis, the next reputational issue? Get prepared. I was going to say be prepared, but it sounds like the Scouts. But you need to get prepared. Put preparedness at the forefront of what you do, and start that bit of how do I consult. If I need to understand my audience, if I need to understand what's going on in an area or within part of the business, where do I do, how do I do that consultation? Have that process so that you can really move it quickly if you need to access it. Training teams, as I said, and that monitoring systems, building that, whether that's having to make do with different things or whether you can get systems in place that you can buy, and test your response. How are you going to deal with an issue? How would you manage it? How would you look at escalation of an issue so that it doesn't become a crisis? Everybody, I think this week's given you lots of other resources to think about. Oh, one other thing. Oh, if you are interested, I'm doing a crisis. I forgot to put this in. I am going to do a 2-hour because I think there's a need for it for people, rather than have a massive thing for organisations, to do a short 2 hours crisis comms tabletop effectively online, which will be here's some stuff and getting you to think about how you deal with it and what you would do. If you're interested in that, just get in touch with me, email me, drop me a line. I'm only there's going to be a limited space because I want it to be as interactive as possible. So do let me know. It's going to be in November at some point when I get that in time. Really just because I think people would benefit from it from a CPD perspective. In terms of additional resources, to get these are 3 really useful bits and pieces. There are lots of other things that are available, but managing the human dimension of disasters is good for kind of looking at the bigger picture of things. I love Lucy Easthope's book. I'm a massive fan. So if you want to get an insight into what happens when a disaster happens and people have to carry on after it, it's that bit when the dust settles after it, what goes on. It just helps you with that understanding of people and mood and human behavior and what happens. And then, as I said, the Survivors Against Terror and the Peace Foundation in Warrington around language is incredibly useful. I will hopefully be able to add to that with something from the Emergency Planning Society in the next few times. I talk endlessly about crisis comms. I will shut up. The new book comes out on the 3rd of November, which is called Everyday Communication Strategies, but is about issues management. I call it my prequel, trying to get ahead of a crisis. What can we do to protect organisations to deal with issues so that they don't become a crisis? So if you're interested, that comes out on the 3rd of November. And I also have lots of free stuff that I put out. So I have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks that picks up on themes of what's going on in that sort of space, and also a monthly case study which I produce. Elliot, I shut up now because you know me, I'll carry on talking if I'm not careful.
It wasn't a hint, Amanda, don't worry. No, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Just to let everyone know as well, Kate's dropped a link in the chat to the government publication around behavioural approach. So if you want to check it out, click the link and download it, have a read, do whatever you need to do. But that was really insightful. We do have a question from Dylan Lambert from Work Networks. Preparation is super important, but with crisis comms, is there also an element of reaction as well?
Yeah, I mean, the key for me is obviously preparation is really essential. Preparation will buy you some time, will put you in a good space. But then the issue, that's why I'm doing the crisis comms kind of simulation, is because there is a bit of like, this has happened, what are you going to do? thinking on your feet, the effective decision making under pressure. So absolutely, I think it's a combination of the two. Do the preparation to put you in the best space possible, but then also train and test yourself so that you know how you respond and you know how you can get better at making quick decisions and decisions with minimal information or with gaps in information. And I think that's our big challenge, because we can't, with most of these situations, you haven't got time to wait until you know everything about what's happened. You have to make the best decision at that point in time.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned mood and tone, obviously understanding that you won't always get it right. So being best positioned for that crisis piece if and when it comes, because you can't necessarily plan for a crisis, but you can be prepared for what to do when a crisis happens. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And we did have a quick chat before as well, just around obviously chaos being the key word that sort of stood out to me, especially it's been a bit relentless with COVID, Brexit, cost of living crisis. But how important is individual resilience?
Yeah, you mentioned the B word. You're not allowed to mention the B word.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, it is. I think this is one of the massive challenges, and I know there was some report that came out this week, which was looking at. I think I've seen it in Prolific North or one of the things about terrible experiences people had had at work, and for me, we can't stop talking about this. I get frustrated, when it's mental. It was Mental Health Awareness Day last
mm,
week, but then you think, is it just a day and then we forget about it? I did a blog this week about I get really frustrated with those bits at the end of programs now that say, if you've been affected by anything in this program, well, actually, we've got to do more than that. It's not good enough to raise all these issues and then just go, well, here's a load of stuff if you need it. We've got to get more active. I think the challenge is, if you're trying to access any kind of support, it's just massively stretched, and there's not a lot of around that. I think the key for comms industry is we've got to keep this conversation more than just a conversation. We've got to look
mm.
at action, and we've got to hold people to account if they've got terrible workplaces. And I've worked in bad workplaces. I have probably been, as I think Nigel Sarbuts, if anybody knows him, message this week. I've probably been responsible for, in some cases, for a pretty appalling workplace, because you react to the surroundings you're in. So we've got to keep that conversation going, and we've got to accept, like with the mood and tone, when we might not get it right all the time, but we'd be big enough to go, yeah, and this is what we need to do, and this is how we need to change. And I think that bit for me is, you've always Ooh,
Oh, looks
did I
like
lose you?
we just lost you there, yeah, for a second. Um, so just one final question I'll squeeze in very quickly from Steve. So what do you think is the best way to test your organization's response to a crisis? The scenario planning days often seem really artificial and don't give you a chance to properly test your comms response.
Well, it's funny you say that. I actually now have got a system that I use. I actually bought a system to use, which gives you a real life kind of simulation, so that you can throw at it emails coming in and tweets coming in and posts coming in and a bit of media, so you can sit and just get immersed in it. It's a proper immersive experience. I've used it a few times. It does, the thing I'm looking to do is a very much a tabletop desk kind of, here's the thing, and talk about it. But that, if you're looking to test your organization or your comms team, that for me is the best way to do it. And the people who have used it with me are just like, say, wow, it gives you that actual feeling as though you've been properly through it, because it throws as much as we can into it. So yeah, those are the ways really. Although they do cost a little bit, and sometimes it takes a bit of planning to do them, but they really do show up where the flaws are, where the gaps are, where the training needs to be, and how you need to develop.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amanda. So emojis in the chat for Amanda, emojis on the screen. Thank you for speaking at commsHERO. Just we've got 10 minutes now until we hear from Steve Hayes on all things authenticity. So thanks again for your time, Amanda, and see you all soon. Have a good
Thanks, guys.
afternoon, everyone.